Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Protestant house church extraordinaire Aaron Snow. Welcome, Aaron Snow, to the podcast.
How's it going?
Good. Well, I'm excited to get going and interview you about your story and everything. And just so our listeners know, I've been friends with Aaron for now 10 years. And it's so cool the way the Lord orchestrated our relationship. I was asking God for someone to disciple me in college, and you moved from Vegas to Austin and started discipling me back in the day. And so it's such a privilege to have you on the show, Aaron, so thank you so much.
Of course, it's an honor.
Yes, well, why don't you give a little background to our listeners about your life, what you're up to now, your professional experience, your family life, religious background, and all of that.
Yeah. So my name's Aaron. My wife and I now live in Keller, Texas, which is a little suburb of Fort Worth. We've got 5 kiddos. Our oldest is a girl. She's 10. And then we've got an 8-year-old, 6-year-old, just turned 7, 4-year-old, and 20-month-old. So the 4 youngest are boys, and our oldest is a girl. So that's fun, keeps us busy. That's really where our focus is in this season of life, is on our family. Being a family, discipling our kids, raising them, and having a healthy marriage, being good spouses to one another. I am the GM for a leather care company based out of Fort Worth. So we manufacture high-end luxury leather care products, conditioners and cleaners for that industry. So I do that as my day job, and then my wife and I, with 2 of our best friends, own a salon in Keller, a hair salon. So I handle some of the business stuff for that business, kind of on the side in my spare time. We are currently, I hate putting labels on it, but talking about our religious preference. You know that's always a funny conversation for me. And it sounds cliche now, but 15 years ago when we started using this language, it wasn't really cliche, but we really just love Jesus. We just try to follow him to the best of our ability, have a relationship with him, and try to do our best to stay in spiritual family in the context of community and hearing God's voice. And we'll talk more about that later, I'm sure. So there's the little summary.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. And yeah, I remember I used to just hate titles for anything. Sometimes it's helpful to provide some clarity, but overall, I'm really looking forward to this conversation because the one thing we have always had in common as friends is like our love for Christ, and that's still true to this day. But yeah, so let's start from the beginning of your story. Like, how did you grow up in your religious background? Because I know you weren't always part of the house church community. So what was that like growing up? And so share with us about that. Yeah,
and even just to respond to even the intro and even the comment you just made, it's funny, and we'll get more into this later. But we don't even really, just to give the listeners a foundation for moving forward, even from right now, we don't even really consider ourselves house church people anymore.
Oh my gosh, you've evolved.
Yes, we've evolved. It's been a continuous change. But it's been a fun journey.
Yes.
So growing up, my wife and I were both raised in Baptist churches in the Bible Belt here in the DFW area. Obviously, I think both of the churches we grew up at dropped the Baptist from the name and became more quote unquote non-denominational churches.
Seeker-friendly.
Yeah, seeker-friendly. Did the whole youth group thing, church camp thing, served in leadership in the youth group, and did that whole deal. So that was both of our upbringing. And yes, definitely grew up in a Christian home. Parents love the Lord. And I would say early on in my childhood, my whole family, it was more about church. It was more about we're just Christians because everyone before my parents, the generations before, grew up going to church.
Yep.
And so that's what you do. You're a Christian. We're white, middle class, neat Christian people who go to church. There wasn't a ton of depth to it at that time, I wouldn't say.
Okay.
And I'm sure we'll continue to get more into that as well.
Yeah, so when do you feel like, maybe it was during your growing up experience, that you had like a profound sense of having a relationship with Jesus himself, and it wasn't just about going to church on Sundays?
Yeah. I think my story is similar to a lot of folks.
It was at summer camp, wasn't it?
Right. No, for real though. So I remember despising the language, and I don't want to discount the fact that it is a biblical principle and that there are people who do have life-changing encounters where from this moment forward, and I believe that I had a handful of those. And it makes the reason that language makes me sad is because it leaves the person to believe that they only ever have one encounter or one experience with the Father that changes their life. And I used to feel pigeonholed into that language, but in the last 10 years, I just don't use that language anymore. I was baptized when I was 6, had no idea what I was doing, didn't know what it meant. I prayed a prayer, right? Like most of us. Didn't mean much to me that I knew of at the time. I would say there's probably three moments that I can speak to. So I was 15 on a retreat with the youth group, sitting outside under the stars, and kind of had this moment with the Lord where it did significantly shift what it meant for me to follow Jesus. There was a real heart change there. Now, I didn't know what that looked like, because discipleship is not really something that we American Christians are particularly good at, especially in a Protestant evangelical setting. And that's not to take any shots. I mean, we're just not great at it. We don't have a system set up and in place that allows for real, true, deep discipleship. But I did have an awesome youth pastor who poured into me. And so that was the first one. Of course, I still continued to be a teenager and go back and forth and have emotional roller coaster spiritual highs and seasons of just blatant disobedience and sin. I would say the next moment would be when I was about 18. I had a real sort of crisis of faith. I remember sitting out in the parking lot of my youth pastor's apartment, and I was already out of high school. But kind of lost in what does this mean to follow Jesus. And I think I got to the point where I was like, I hit a crossroads where it was like, I either am going to be all in or I'm going to be all out. I remember just weeping in the parking lot. It was midnight, and I just asked all the hard questions. And my youth pastor, he just sat there and listened, and he answered the best he could, but he left a lot of room for me to really just dig and journey and wrestle, which was really pivotal for me. And I don't know if I've even ever told him that, but I need to tell him that.
Wow.
So obviously from that moment forward, I did choose to be all in.
Yeah.
That was a real pivotal moment where I said, okay, I've landed to the conclusion that Christ has captured my heart, and I'm going to serve him the rest of my life. I had no idea what that looked like. Again, I continued down a path of ups and downs and, sinful behavior during seasons and really obedient, passionate following Jesus behaviors. So then I would say fast forward till I was about 22 would be the third 22, 23.
Towards the end of college, or?
Yep, I was a senior in college. And for a few years before that, I had been, working on staff at various churches, felt called into ministry. I'm doing quotes here for the listeners. Called into ministry, had been on staff at several different churches. And at the time I was in a church planting internship cohort at the church I was on staff at. And the pastor, I was going to go up the evangelical career ladder, right? I was going to be a youth pastor because that's what you do. That's what's cool.
Yeah.
Going to do that. And then whatever. But that was what I felt I was passionate about because that was just the default, right? You go be a youth pastor. But I went into this church planting internship thinking this is stupid. I don't care about planting churches. I want to be a youth pastor. But I did it. It was a 9-month-long internship that kind of straddled my junior and senior years of college. Junior year of college. And we spent 9 months learning about planting churches. I was in business school at the same time, so I was writing business plans for my upper level classes, and we came toward the end of the church planting cohort, and the director said, hey, we need you to turn your prospectus in, which is a prospectus in church planting language is just our version of a business plan. And it just didn't sit well with me. It really bothered me. I told the director, I said, hey, I'm sorry, I'm not doing that. I just did that for school, for business, and I can't reconcile in my mind why I would need to put together my target market and my $1 million budget and build my team and find my location and all that. I can't do it. He was cool with that. Well, not cool, but he understood. Yeah. The whole team of the church planting cohort, we then went to Southeast Asia for 3 weeks. And the idea there was for us to learn and experience what God was doing in his kingdom all over the world and how that looks different from America. And it sort of wrecked me. And it confused me a lot too, because I was like, wait, we just spent 9 months learning how to plant what I call church in a box. Yeah. But now we're over here in Asia and we're seeing God move in all these different ways through church planting movements and small organic communities of faith and hybrid deals where you meet in third spaces and you have a gathering once a month above a restaurant in Bangkok, and you work a deal out with the restaurant owner where you bring all your church people upstairs and they all order food. And so it's good for the restaurant, and then it's a free place to gather. But then all throughout the week, you're meeting throughout the city in different people's homes for more of a house church or small group setting, right? So I came home from that and it really messed with me. And I kind of at that point started to grow kind of disenfranchised with sort of American church as we knew it. What happened then was some friends and I who were on similar pages, they felt similarly to what I did, but they weren't in ministry settings. So they were searching for something. I don't know that they had a language to put to it, but I had been reading a lot of books and been to Southeast Asia and had mentors. And so I started putting language around what following Jesus could look like maybe outside of the walls of the church, right? And again, this is all now cliche language in 2020. Back then it wasn't necessarily. It was very new for me, especially at the time. So we started just getting together real informally outside of a Starbucks, and we would stay there until they closed, and we became friends with the baristas, and we were there every week when we would play our guitar out on the front and worship and pray. And then when they kicked us out, we would go back to our apartment and stay up till 3 a.m. worshiping and praying. And we felt more alive than we had ever felt in our walk with Jesus throughout our entire lives. But it was outside of the context of a quote unquote real church.
Like a normal American mega church or any kind of church really.
Yeah. And so I think at the time we were a little angry. We were a little frustrated. We felt like we had been lied to our whole lives.
Yeah.
Looking back, obviously, we were young and immature, and that we had no place to feel that way. But granted, we did. But what happened after that was really beautiful. We had kind of made a pact that we weren't gonna. We all joked in our little house church that sort of grew organically and naturally by accident, that our butts hurt from sitting in the pew our whole lives, and we just didn't want to sit in the pew any longer. Yeah. So we started spending all day, every day together. Obviously we were at work or we were at class, but we'd be together anytime we weren't at work or at school or whatever. We would be together, and we would be down on the streets serving the homeless, or we would be in our living room worshiping or at the coffee shop. And it was just this really beautiful organic kingdom life that we had never experienced. We started seeing a lot of true, deep discipleship happening, where we were seeing people who did not know Jesus encounter our community or our spiritual family and be welcomed into it and start following Jesus.
Wow.
Fast forward, it ended up growing into a nonprofit. The group that I went through the church planting internship with found out what we were doing and brought us under their wing, and they thought it was really neat and interesting and cool. And so they sort of helped us get on our feet with, making it a nonprofit. And not that we wanted it at the time, we kind of despised it, but we realized that was kind of the world we were in, they were kind of our spiritual covering, if you will.
Okay.
Again, even though we kind of scoffed at such things at the time. So we did that, and then so we had this nonprofit, and I was about to graduate college. We had a growing, vibrant community of about 40 people at the time, and we started talking about, well, hey, we need to multiply and split off and make separate groups, and so this thing can grow, and it's not just about this one group of people, but there's multiple people. And we were doing our work downtown in Fort Worth with the homeless, and started causing some waves there in a really positive way, and doing some neat things. Our nonprofit leased a property in sort of the inner city of Fort Worth where we had a guy's house and a girl's house. They lived there full time and just lived life. They worked their jobs or went to school, but then they tutored kids after school in the neighborhood, or had pancake breakfasts and kickball tournaments on Saturdays. And it was a really neat time. Should I pause there, or...
Well, I'm curious, is that around the time when you and Morgan, your now wife, really kind of hit it off and took it to the next level?
Yeah, so she was one of those initial friends that I met, who I mentioned earlier was in the same place as I was. And when we met, there was really 4 of us at the core, and we were just best friends.
Yeah.
And Morgan and I, it was funny, we were really good friends. We weren't romantically interested in one another. In fact, we joke, we used to give each other dating advice on each other's boyfriends or girlfriends at the time. But really, we were in a place in life where we had been in different relationships, and we just weren't super interested in that during that season. We truly came to a place where we were just so in love with Jesus and what he was doing in our lives and what we were experiencing in this, new walk with him, that we weren't really interested in being in a relationship. And so we were really content. What naturally happened, though, is within a matter of about 6 months, we kind of realized, oh my gosh.
Oh,
hey. Hey, girl.
Oh, hey, girl.
And we realized that we had sort of fallen in love with one another. And so within a year of meeting, we became best friends, got engaged, and got married. All within about a year.
Wow.
14 months. We met in August and were married by the end of October the next year.
Wow.
And so, and that was beautiful. And I love that because we were in the same place spiritually where we knew there was more. We loved Jesus, but we didn't care much for what we had experienced in the church that we grew up in. Now, there were beautiful, valuable things, and they shaped who we are today. But we just, for us moving forward, didn't think that was something that we fit into. For various reasons.
So I've kind of 2 questions. One is, when y'all got married, did that kind of change the dynamics of the group? Or did that just further strengthen the community? Or how did that actually impact the community when y'all got married?
Yeah. So we were the first, if I'm not mistaken, we were the first of anyone in the community to get married. So it certainly changed things. Now, right a couple months after we got married, we ended up moving to Las Vegas, and that was something that the whole community knew about, that had been planned for a while, and they sort of sent us out as a community to Vegas to go and do what we had done in Fort Worth and start new communities in Vegas, serve the poor, create a new network of house churches, and do that kind of a thing, and under the umbrella of the nonprofit organization. And what was funny after that is, we left, and then everyone just started getting married to each other. And I love telling this story because, growing up in the church or being in ministry, there's all sorts of rules that everyone puts on you, even as a staff member, where you can't be in romantic relationship, or you can't ride in the car with someone of the opposite sex because it might look bad. And I see value to all those things. But what we experienced in the context of this deep Christian community was people were in deep community with one another, serving Jesus, and they started to fall in love with the Jesus they saw in the other person. And out of that initial community, there were 15 people that got married.
Wow.
30 people that got married. No, I'm
15
sorry.
couples?
15 people that got married.
Okay.
16 people, so 8 couples.
Okay.
I love math. So 8 couples, and we were kind of like, wait, is this okay? I don't think this is supposed to be okay. But it was beautiful. And now looking back, like all those couples now have babies, and it was fun to look back and see that type of fruit. It didn't all turn out how we thought. I mean, that community, every house church community we've ever started in any of the 3 cities we've lived in, none of them are still together as a community. There's still lots of deep relationships that exist, which to me, that's what's important. I got really shook up about that because the culture in the church planting world told me that if we did it right, they would stay solid communities forever. But I don't really care about that anymore. Yeah. It was a great journey. And there's, back to your point, there's now a bunch of people that got married and had families and whatnot out of that.
Are a lot of those people doing their own house churches now, do you think? Or are they doing something else? Or
honestly, I don't think many of them are doing house church stuff. Some of them aren't doing any kind of church, quote unquote, like a model.
But do they still love Jesus?
Correct.
Okay.
My understanding is a good majority of them do.
Yeah.
Some of them are back in regular institutional American churches. Some of them are Catholic. Some of them are Anglican, and they've all gone on their different journeys. Yeah. And that season we had in that deep house church setting, I believe shaped all of us and where we're at today and how we choose to pursue Jesus.
Yeah. And the other question I had, and you don't have to answer this, but I was just curious, like in this house church context in Fort Worth, when did you start experiencing maybe some of the more charismatic gifts of the Spirit, and what was that like? Or did you experience that before the communities? So when did all that happen? Was it kind of in this context, or
Yeah. So a couple of so in our first house church, there were people from all different walks of life and different upbringings, and one of that original core of the 4 people that I mentioned earlier, kind of that core group, me and 3 others. One of them had a lot of experience in those more charismatic streams. So she brought a lot of new language to us that we had never experienced. And at the time, we weren't in a place where, like, we just didn't care anymore about being right about our doctrine. We didn't care about arguing with people if they said something that didn't jive with our Baptist or Reformed roots. We just felt alive, and we were experiencing God in a new way. And frankly, it was pretty exciting to have some flavor and adventure to our walk with Jesus. And that particular person brought that. And so we ran with it. Now we would find ourselves in different settings with other groups that were like, what we felt at the time was maybe a little over the top charismatic. But again, we just didn't have much of a filter. So that began the journey then. So I think I was probably 23 when a lot of that I started being introduced to a lot of that. When we went to Vegas and then eventually to Austin, that just grew, and we got connected with more folks in different organizations and all over the country and the world who exposed us to more of those things that I feel so lucky and blessed to have experienced. And my relationship with Jesus and my connection to His Spirit is now 10 times more than I believe it ever would have been had I just stuck with my guns and stuck with my Baptist roots, right?
Yeah. And so you were in Vegas for about 2 years?
2 years, yeah, and that was the plan.
That was the plan. And then, but you found your way to Austin to be with me, so thank you.
Yep.
I obviously didn't know I existed back then, but so you moved to Austin, and you wanted to train up students in starting house churches on campuses, is my understanding. So, talk a little bit about what that experience was like. I mean, I obviously was part of that for about 1.5 to 2 years there at UT. But I'd be curious to hear your perspective on that. And then, like, I know at some point you did transition out of the nonprofit world to work in business, and you're a very talented and gifted businessman. So I want to hear about that as well.
Yeah. So we had 2 years in Vegas, and that was the plan with our board. It was like, hey, we're going to go, what we thought at the time was we would go to a new city every couple of years and plant new works and raise up local leadership and then move on. We did that in Fort Worth. We went to Vegas, did that in Vegas, and then it came time to go down to Austin. And during our time in Vegas, we had gotten connected with some other super like-minded people who were doing a lot of really cool work on the college campuses. We had never had any exposure to any college campus ministry. When I was in college, I commuted to school, so I was never super involved in any club or organization. I think I went to the BSM, Baptist Student Ministries, once or twice to get a free hamburger between classes, for something they were doing. But I met these folks, and we all had, there were 5 families, and we all had our own independent nonprofit organizations, but we were all really like-minded, and we felt like we could come together as sort of a national team. There were folks that lived in Pittsburgh, folks that lived in New York, Kansas, and different parts of the country. So what we did is we just developed this training together as a team, and we would put on these trainings that we called Student CPX, Student Church Planting Experience. And we were based in Vegas, and we did a training there. We did some trainings in Kansas, and we had done some in Austin while we lived in Vegas with this team. And a community sort of birthed out of those trainings in Austin, and they didn't really have any shepherding. And we realized really quickly that something beautiful was happening in Austin, and we just felt a responsibility to go there to spiritually mother and father these students who we may or may not have opened their eyes up intentionally or unintentionally, and they all were kind of leaving their institutional churches, which wasn't necessarily our goal, but what they were doing instead was they were leading their classmates to Jesus and baptizing them in the hot tub at their apartment and starting new student-led home churches in their context. And that was beautiful, but we knew that they needed just some shepherding. So my wife and I moved down there. At the time, we had 1 kiddo. Shortly after getting there, we were pregnant with our second, and we had been in Austin about a year, and things were going great. My wife and I had become a part of a house church in Austin, separate from all the different things that the students were doing. They had their own really vibrant community. You remember the King Street House Church?
Yes, of course.
And so around a year being into Austin, maybe a year and a half, our family was growing. We were scraping by. I was raising support for the nonprofit. My wife would, work at Starbucks or go back to Fort Worth. She's a hairstylist, so she would go back to Fort Worth every 6 weeks and do hair for a few days. I would substitute teach and just do little odd jobs. But I kind of came to this conclusion that, I didn't want to be raising support. And there's a whole nother kind of soapbox to that, as I, at the time, realized that the nonprofit world, so much was changing politically and in the landscape of our Christian culture in America. Again, a whole nother conversation. I just didn't feel that raising support and living on support was going to be sustainable for the way that Morgan and I knew we wanted to grow our family. Yeah. So I had a real wrestle with that. And basically, long story short, the Lord said, hey, you have a business degree. It's time to close the chapter, this chapter of ministry, vocational ministry. Close down the nonprofit, and I want you to go back into the business world or go into the business world. And he spoke to me. He said, I'm going to do more for you in my kingdom. I'm going to do more with you in my kingdom. In the business world than I could in the vocational ministry world. And at the time, I didn't know what that meant, and I had no idea what it looked like. I kind of pushed back for a little while. I tried to keep the nonprofit open. I went out and got a 9-to-5 job working for a little tech startup in Austin. Great gig. We bought our first house. Like I said, tried to keep the nonprofit open. I hired an administrative assistant, and that lasted about 6 months. And the Lord was like, hey, dude, I told you to be done with it. Yeah. So did that, and life changed a lot. We were, all of a sudden, we were just normal people, normal followers of Jesus. We weren't in any ministry roles. We weren't traveling around speaking at trainings and conferences. Nobody was writing about us in their books anymore. We weren't doing anything noteworthy, so to speak, that people blog about and that's in the headlines, which is a little wrestle for me and my identity. A little
shot to the pride.
Yep. I had a lot of stuff. My identity was wrapped up in a lot of that ministry stuff. So it was tough, but our family was growing, and it was a good season. We were in Austin for about another year and a half and found out baby number 3 was on the way. And so we sold our house there and moved back home, which is for the DFW area. And there's a lot more after that, but I'll let you ask a question.
Well, I guess the next question is like when you did transition into business, and then really, let's just start with where we left off, where you come up here and you're working in a new business up here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and you're quote unquote normal. You're not doing vocational ministry, your name's not getting out there or whatever. How did that affect your relationship with Christ? How did your spirituality develop? How did your the way you follow Jesus in the context of your family start developing as you're getting more kids? So that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, I mean, it was a big change. And I say this all the time, I love this story. Whenever I was in student ministry, I'll never forget talking with a student who I'd been discipling, and he just couldn't seem to get it right. He kept on making the same mistakes over and over and wouldn't have his quiet time. And I remember sitting down with him at a coffee shop talking about it for the 12th time. And I'll never forget it. One day he just looked at me and was like, dude, would you stop? Like, that's all really easy for you to say. You get paid to follow Jesus.
Ooh.
And so that really resonated with me. And I think I was like 19 at the time. And so I didn't really see anything play out from that until years later. But that stuck with me. And so from that moment forward, I always felt weird. I'm not saying that I think it's wrong to be in vocational ministry and to be paid. But to answer your question, I went from getting paid when I directed our nonprofit and didn't have a boss, didn't have a schedule, made my own schedule, could sleep in if I wanted, go on vacation when I wanted, if we had money, but travel and speak at conferences and do all this and that and develop curriculum for our church planting stuff. And it was my job. So I didn't have to balance that. It was just something that was very easy to do.
Yeah.
Well, whenever all of a sudden I've got a 9-to-5 job and I'm quote unquote a normal Christian now, it became more of a challenge, and I had to make sacrifices. So I had to, if I wanted to spend really intentional time with Jesus, I had to get up before anyone else in my house and spend time with the Lord. And if I had a ministry opportunity, if you will, I had to either say no to it or fit that into my life as a father and as a husband and as an employee. And so it was a significant change, but one of the things the Lord spoke to me when I made that transition was that he wanted to use us to model for the next generation of believers what it looked like to be a normal Christian and follow him and still make an impact in the kingdom. Because you and I both know, growing up in a Protestant culture or evangelical world, it's that if you really love Jesus, you're going to do one of two things. You're going to go into ministry. You're either going to be a missionary or go on staff at a church or some sort of campus ministry.
Right.
And this is an important story to tie into that. Is I'll never forget one of the students that we discipled through all that, was on a great career track, graduated with her degree, and she had been with us from the beginning. And we were excited. We were like, cool, you're the first one to go through all 4 years of college and go through the training. And what are you going to do now? And I'll never forget it. And she had it all planned out. She was going to do exactly what her disciplers did. She was going to go into ministry. And it hit me that here we were doing all this training for, how to be a believer in the marketplace and make an impact for the kingdom and be in a real job, quote unquote, not in vocational ministry. And we weren't modeling it.
Wow.
We were actually in ministry ourselves. And so, of course, the people we were discipling and influencing wanted to follow in our footsteps. So that was another big thing that caused us to transition. And the Lord he just spoke really clearly. I want to use you as an example and train you and show you how to model for others that you can be a normal person who's not in vocational ministry, who can make a great impact for the kingdom and have to balance financial things and manage your time well and your family and your marriage and all of that, but still do great things for the kingdom.
That's incredible. So over the past few years, now you have 5 children and you're obviously still full-time business. What would you say are like the ways you impact the kingdom now as like a quote unquote normal Christian? Like, what are some ways? And obviously, you know, as you're telling your story, I keep just thinking about the hidden life of Jesus in Nazareth, right? Mm-hmm. Joseph and Mary and Jesus, Joseph the carpenter, in this podunk town. But the Lord, like 30 out of the 33 years of his life when he was on earth was in that context of hiddenness, which I love. And so I love that you are emphasizing that and putting that forward. And another thing that I'm reminded of is in the Catholic Church, we call the family the domestic church, the house church. Mm-hmm. And that's the number one, like the new evangelization, the evangelization of the world happens only through the family. Mm-hmm. And so I'm so excited to hear about those dynamics. So like even currently or in the past several years, what does that look like to teach your kids about Christ and to like have a vibrant like spiritual life? And how is that manifested? Like what do you do on Sundays? You know, what do you, since you're now no longer part of house churches, and why did you drop those titles? And like, so I'm just curious about kind of this next development.
Yeah. And I'll try and just summarize all that up into as brief of an answer as I can. So I think it all started one night. We were living back in DFW, and, you know, we had always done house church. That's all we had ever done from when we got married. And so our default was, well, when we move back to DFW, we're leaving our house church in Austin, so we need to start a new one. And I'll never forget, it may have been our second time around, our second go at it back after we got home. And here we were sitting in our living room with a few other couples, and we were sitting around talking about what to do when we gather for this little 2-hour block of time once a week that we get together. We just wanted to make the best of our time. You know, we wanted to be faithful and make sure that it was good for everyone. And my wife was I was looking at her over on the couch, and she was just I could see it in her eyes, just getting frustrated. And about 30 minutes into the conversation, she just threw up her hands and was like, I'm so sick of talking about this. And you gotta understand, she had been doing this for 6 or 7 years at the time, having these same conversations. And I realized that we were no different than the real institutional church model that we had left. We just put it into a living room and made it smaller. We were still focused on the wrong things. We were sitting there talking about what do we do in a 2-hour chunk of time out of how many hours in a week? 160 something. And my wife nailed it. She said, I don't want to talk about this anymore.
We're compartmentalizing. We're not making it our whole life.
She's like, I don't care what we do for 2 hours once a week. I want to talk about what we're doing all throughout the week as people who claim to follow Jesus.
Wow. Like, Morgan.
Yeah,
yes.
I know. She's awesome. Like, what does life look like when I wake up on Tuesday morning and drop kids at school, or go have a play date at the park, or I go do hair at the salon, or Aaron, you're at the office having to fire someone or hire someone? Like, what does that kingdom life look like all throughout the week? Why can't we spend our 90% of our time talking about that and 10% talking about what we might do during a time of gathering intentionally to further that stuff? We had it flip-flopped, and I think most churches have it flip-flopped. Their focus is on the once-a-week gathering. And you look at church budgets and where their energy and time and effort is spent, it's on what we do once a week. It's not on what happens throughout our lives during the week and the day-to-day. And that moment, that was probably 5 years ago when it really shifted for us, and we were like, you know what? We're refusing to let ourselves fall into the trap ever again of putting so much focus and emphasis on a weekly gathering. we are going to, and it was hard because people don't like that. It doesn't sit well with people. They think you are not a Christian anymore. They think you can't possibly love Jesus if you don't go to church. Well, we had everyone knew we were the house church people. So it took years to get them to be accepting and okay with that, which we didn't care, but we had finally gotten them there. And then now we start saying, well, we don't necessarily have a gathering once a week. Well, wait, what do you do then? So you don't go to church, but you also don't have people over and do your church service in your living room anymore? No, not necessarily. We might have some friends that are a part of our spiritual family community come over and pray if they're going through a hard time, or if we're going through a hard time, and we might share a meal together. And those are the things we started focusing on, the things that really foster that connection, that relationship, and that spurring one another on toward Christ. And it's not perfect. It's missing multiple things, and it's messy. And I'm not claiming to have figured anything out, because we still don't know. We have 5 kids. We don't know, if are we hurting them by not letting them be involved in the kids ministry at a local church, and we've done that too. We've tried that, and we keep coming back to anything we can do to make sure that we're equipping our kids to know what it looks like to follow Jesus in the context of community, other people at the core, and that relationships are important, and hearing God's voice is important, and seeking his kingdom. Now, that might look like some of the kids end up going to a real church. They might have a house church. They might kind of do something like what we do. But our goal is that the focus wouldn't be on that your walk with Jesus and your connection to him at the end of the day comes down to where you place your membership at church and where you go once a week. We just refuse to let that be what defines our walk with God.
Yeah, and you just kind of went over some of those core things, but just rehash again, like, these are the core principles. These are the core things about following Jesus you want to transmit to your kids. You want to disciple them in this path.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just want to kind of hear that again.
Yeah. So for us, and I've talked to some people about this, and their eyes light up and they love it, and other people just blow holes in it and tear it apart, and that's fine. We haven't got it figured out. But what we have narrowed down in my walk with the Lord, and in my wife's journey with the Lord too, the things that we've narrowed down are, if we can do nothing more than teach and disciple and equip our kids to be able to hear God's voice for themselves. Now, of course, that sounds simpler than it is, right? They need to know truth. They can't know truth if they don't hear. They can't hear God's voice if they don't know truth to filter.
Right.
Which means they need to know the Word. And when I say the Word, I mean the person and the book. And they're going to learn a lot about that through the book, but they're also going to learn a lot about that through having a relationship with him and having his Spirit live in them. That's our number one goal. And in our family, there's 2 really important things that are a part of our family day in and day out, that I believe lays the foundation and breeds this type of kingdom life that we're talking about. Is obviously at the base of it all is hearing God's voice. The next thing is that we encourage one another and we speak life. That's what we do. That's what God calls us to do in Hebrews 3:13, right? Encourage one another daily as long as it is today, so that you're not hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. If we're not speaking life to one another, the enemy's going to come in. He's going to sow seeds, and we're going to become resentful, and our hearts are going to get hardened. The next thing is confession. We're open and we're transparent with our struggles, and we foster a sense of need for God. We need him. We need his grace. We need his sacrifice, because we're messed up, broken people. So in our family, we, on a weekly, if not daily basis, confess our sins to one another. We apologize. We ask for forgiveness, and then we pray for one another, like it says in James. So we confess our sins, and so that we're healed. And sometimes we bust out the anointing oil, and we do that. And we pray over one another. So those are some really deep things. We don't spend time in our family, nor do my wife or I spend time in our relationships talking about all the things that we see so many other people talking about that to us don't matter. You and I have talked a lot about non-negotiables and things that are negotiables, and we have a lot of negotiables, and we're okay with that, and we can be in community with people that share different negotiables. There's a few non-negotiables for us that we let those be the foundation and the filter. We don't want to waste time talking about whether or not you think it's okay to speak in tongues, or is prophecy legit, or did the gifts die after 100 years after the last apostle walked the earth, or do you have to be physically water baptized to go to heaven? Like, we don't concern ourselves with those things. In my journey, in my experience, walking with the Lord, leading people to Christ, seeing people walk away from Christ, seeing people die, none of those things mattered. They didn't foster and push people closer into relationship with Jesus in a way that they were going to go and bring glory to God and grow his kingdom. Yeah. So does that answer the question?
Yeah.
A little bit?
Yeah, I think what I find attractive about the way you talk about these things, what I sense from your spirituality is true authenticity. Like, you just want to be authentically following Christ, and that's a beautiful thing. As you know from my journey, it was about 5 years ago that I became Catholic, which was to me a kind of a curveball, but really it's actually not that much of a curveball when you think about it, because my heart for being part of house church and those intentional gatherings was to be part of the early church, the book of Acts, like to, have those things come alive for me, and like to be part of what I saw in the Word. And so that eventually led me to reading the early church fathers and discovering that the early church was in fact Catholic, which blew my mind, and I didn't understand all that. But now it's been 5 years. I've been Catholic for 5 years. We've had some fun conversations, and so I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts, and feel free not to answer these or to answer them, whatever you want to do. And then I'll come back to another question that I skipped earlier. But
we had such common ground
since we began.
That was so beautiful. I thought that was
like, we don't talk about it all the time that we get together for our breakfasts, but
in that core
when we do teaching. But yeah, so what is your perception of the Catholic Church in general, and like what have you found to be kind of attractive about it, if anything? From your vantage point, seeing kind of my journey and some other of your friends go into the Catholic Church.
Yeah. So I'm very ignorant. I'll start there as a sort of a foundation for my answer. But from what I do know, I love a lot of the things that I love about it have to do with some of the history you just shared. That was new for me as we started talking. The liturgy and some of the repetitive things that are done. I believe that those really do instill some great practices and some great just underlying values. And I never thought I'd say this, but as you shared, some of the structure that you have shared about is intriguing to me, and I see the value of it now that I have 5 kids and we have to have structure and order in our family. Yeah. I see how that's beneficial globally in the overall universal church, right? Yes. And then we've talked a lot about the Eucharist. Yes. That is something that's really been hard for me to wrap my head around.
I think it's hard for everyone to wrap it's a mystery. Right?
It is. Now, and it's that mystery that draws me to it, and it makes me so fascinated. In my bit of my rebellious streak that I've had since I was a kid, I think and this may move into the next question of what you may sort of disagree with. And I don't know that I necessarily disagree with it, but in that rebellion, I don't know that I love the fact that this beautiful thing that I've taken part of, specifically communion, right? Not the Eucharist. That it would have to be put into such a box for it to be as powerful as I think God intended for it to be. But at the same time, I hear the stories and I see that tradition and how it was carried down for so long and how beautiful that is. So I'm kind of torn between that. Yeah. But I don't like the thought that it's got to be given by this special man and it's blessed by him. And if it's not this particular man, that it doesn't hold the power that I've experienced it to hold. So, I also, one of the things I struggle with, and again, a lot of this is out of a place of ignorance, is I've always wrestled with the idea of, and I know this is probably not accurate, but from a Protestant perspective, the idea that there's this man, this priest, that is kind of my like conduit to the Father. Yeah. And again, I don't think that a Catholic would actually say that that's actually accurate, right? But that's been my perception. I love the act of confession, and I love that there is a safe man that you go to, and it's a thing that you do. You don't get out of that. You go and you take confession, and that is, like I shared a moment ago, something super important in our family that we do and we champion. And so again, to hear that, well, to do it right, or the way you should be doing it is to go into this booth with this guy. That's weird for me. Not that it's right or wrong, but that is something that I've wrestled to wrap my head around. I think it is important for that confession to be done in a healthy context. Like for our kids, obviously they do it with us. We're their priest, you could say.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the church would say that, especially, well, by virtue of your baptism, like we all share in the priesthood of all believers, right? But then there's also ministerial priests, different than the baptismal priesthood of all believers. But then there's a special sense in which, as the leader of the domestic church, you are a priest of your household.
Right.
Not that you would give the sacrament of confession or the other sacraments to your children, but but there's a both and that I love so much. It's like, hey, these aren't actually mutually exclusive things. You could do both. Right. That I love. And so that was cool. Like I just was curious, like kind of, and I love hearing the tension and the struggle. And so I'm not going to go into all the things that I really, really want to go into right now, but unless you would want to talk about those things. But yeah, anything like specific that you would, I mean, I guess we covered the disagreement one. But I guess some of those hesitations, is that the reason maybe you haven't yet kind of explored the Catholic Church as a family yet, or have you? Or like, what are some things that's like, you know what, that might be worth exploring? And are you kind of open to that? Or like, what does that look like as far as exploring the Catholic Church at this stage in your life with a family of 5 kids and a wife?
Yeah. And I'll be honest, back to the titles and things, like we struggle to put a label on ourselves at all. Like even calling myself Protestant or evangelical, I don't jive with. Like I'm not a fan of it.
I never called myself Protestant when I was Protestant.
Right. And so I think to sum up that question, I would say we've subscribed to so many different variations of following Jesus, that so-and-so or this group or that group or these parents or those mentors said that we should, whether that was a denomination, a certain doctrine, a certain model of doing church. We subscribe to so many of them, and the common denominator that I found in all of them is they all trap, in my experience, they all trap people into focusing on things that don't seem to matter in the overall grand scheme. And ever since we have removed ourselves from those labels being put on us, we've been able to stay hyper-focused on what we feel like matters the most. Yeah. And honestly, if I'm honest, it terrifies me to think of going back to any one of them or a new one and subscribing to it, because I believe that there would be this pull toward needing to focus on something that might not matter in the grand scheme. And I don't know, call it rebellion, call it laziness, call it whatever. We've just found ourselves in this place where it's like, from what we believe about Jesus and the fruit that we've seen since we've been operating and following him in this way that we are, it keeps us protected from all the other noise, all the things that all these different religious groups, the culture in that group, the label, the doctrine, the denomination that they want to put on you and handcuff you by. none of those are done with bad intention, but it just seems to happen in all of them.
Yeah.
And so for us to feel the freedom to walk without those handcuffs, but still really love Jesus and make an impact in his kingdom and in people's lives in a really natural, organic way has just brought so much life to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that sum it up?
Yeah. And, it's interesting to me, like, one thing that my dad and I have noticed since becoming Catholic is just, it's so rooted in the incarnation, that the Word was made flesh. And when Jesus became man, like, he put limits on himself. The limitless God put limits on himself.
Right.
And so we see in the Catholic Church an expression of that. And so with the Eucharist, for instance, it's just interesting it's as if I'm like hearing my own paradigm before I became Catholic and the same concerns.
Yeah.
And I just, as your fellow brother in Christ, just from my own experience, and I know that like the Catholic Church, like you can turn it into something that it shouldn't be or whatever. But the whole purpose of the church is to provide us an encounter with Christ. And so everything is central to the Eucharist because the Eucharist is Jesus Christ in our midst under the appearance of bread and wine, right? So it's not about a preacher. All the angels and saints, the veneration of Mary, everything that is there is all bent towards pointing us to Christ. Right. And so from my own experience, I found that far from distracting me from the main thing, it's drawn me closer to the main thing. And that's something I think from the house church days, and even before that, really, but growing up as an evangelical and then going into house church and being part of charismatic circles, the one thing I truly love and value is that their emphasis is always that friendship with Christ. And if I had a pitch for the Catholic Church, it would be that it just gets deeper.
Right.
Like the intimacy that you can have between you and the Lord in that one flesh union with Christ in the Eucharist. If that becomes the main thing if you became Catholic, like let that be the main thing, because that's what the church wants it to be the main thing. But yes, if it becomes about the institution or these things and you lose track of Christ himself, then it's all for naught.
Yeah.
So I think we share a commonality there. I just want to share that from my own experience that like that's what I found.
Everything that you've shared with me in the last couple of years, I imagine, and I've heard it in your voice, all of these things that might feel to me like they would be restrictive. The sense I get from you is you maybe had those same concerns early on, but they actually, in the context of that structure and what I think maybe are restrictions, actually brought you a lot of freedom and would potentially bring me a lot of freedom, right? And I see that. We see it with our kids, and it's a parenting principle, right?
Yeah.
Kids need structure. A good friend of mine told me one time, with too much structure breeds rebellion, and not enough structure breeds insecurity. And I think that really plays into this wrestle of, which, if any, do we fall into? Do we subscribe to? And I think in this case, the structure that you've shared with me, the little bit that I know about the Catholic faith, I do think that the level of structure could bring a good balanced amount of structure to bring a lot of freedom.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be too much to produce rebellion or not enough to produce insecurity. So it's very fascinating to me, 100%.
Yeah. That's beautiful. So one of my questions that I'm excited to ask you about is, in light of your journey, in light of my own journey, what do you see the Holy Spirit doing these days? Like, what's going on? Like, where's this going? What are you thinking?
Yeah, and it's funny. People that know me a lot, I've been saying these things for years, and they, roll their eyes, or I'm a broken record. And a part of it was birthed out of my anti-institutional church days and my hyper house church days. But now the thing that's interesting is now that I'm not really in either of those camps, I still feel the same way, and I still am seeing the same thing. So there's no doubt, right? Like, take America, for example. There's no doubt that we're in a post-Christian society in America. Like, you can't argue that. If you look back at history, we're seeing just the very early stages of what we saw in Europe, what took place in Europe. And I was in Europe last year at this time, and man, I went by these beautiful empty cathedrals.
Yep.
And I I believe, and whether I'm right or wrong doesn't matter, don't care, but I feel pretty strongly that with what's happening politically and in the government and with our post-Christian nation, that I think, if not in my lifetime, but in my kids' lifetime, you will see just what you see in Europe. We'll have a bunch of empty church buildings, and we will be a purely post-Christian society, and it won't be the norm anymore to be Christian or Catholic, right? And so what that has caused my wife and I to do is say, our number one goal is to disciple our children in a way that their relationship with Jesus and their pursuit of him is not dependent upon a system or a structure or a building or a gathering or a program or any of that. But that if they were dropped in the desert in Africa and had none of that, would they have we equipped them to follow Jesus passionately and hear his voice, right? That's kind of what I see the Holy Spirit doing. Now that sounds cynical and it sounds bad, but what I'm seeing happen is every single day, and maybe this is because Morgan and I have a bit of a reputation now in this area for 12 years. We've been that couple who quit church. And we were on staff. I was on staff at mega churches and was a ministry, blah, blah, blah. And we don't go to church, but everyone knows we love Jesus. And every single week we have encounters with people. We'll run into them at the grocery store or at the soccer game. And it's over and over. They'll say, oh yeah, the common theme that I'm hearing from everyone, and it's so weird that this is 12 years later, is we can't do it. We just don't feel like we fit. We love Jesus so much, but we don't fit. And hey, I have to be honest, none of those people, including ourselves, have ever tried to fit in the Catholic faith. Who knows? Hey. Might be a beautiful thing. But to answer your question, what do we see the Holy Spirit doing? I really believe that he is calling his followers to follow him in a way that is free from all the noise and the junk. And it's real and it's raw and it's relationship based and it's authentic and it's not dependent upon a weekly gathering. It's kingdom life day in and day out. And that's what I'm seeing happen. Now, the challenge is none of us have a grid or a paradigm for it. I would like to think my wife and I have a little bit of a paradigm for it, but even we struggle with that. And so I think he's going to start revealing to us all what it looks like to follow him, regardless of all those other things. So, yeah. Yeah,
I mean, what comes to mind for me is just the intensity of a beautiful and powerful prayer life. Like, I sometimes go visit the sick in a nursing home, and I think about that. Like, if I was in their situation, what would I have to foster my relationship with Christ? And ultimately, it's just an interior prayer. It's like that Saint Therese of Lisieux said, it's like a surging of the heart towards heaven. That's what prayer is. And that's why I draw inspiration from the saints that have gone before us, because they've lived in some of these circumstances and they show us kind of how to make it work. But man, their commonality is prayer, like in a fiery love for Christ. And it's like that interior, you got to have that piping hot, or else when things go dark around us, it's going to be like, you're either going to fall into the abyss or you're going to like shine and light up the world, you know? Okay, so last questions. First of all, I want to just know, what is your favorite attribute of Jesus? And the second and last question is, what is your final advice to the listeners out there?
Yeah. So my favorite thing, and you sent this over, I'm just going to find it. Okay, here we go. My favorite thing, and this, again, back to that underlying little bit of rebellion that I believe is from the Lord. I believe he put that in me. Now I had to learn to harness it, and I'm still learning to harness it, because a lot of times it rears its head in ugly ways. But throughout my life, it's also been the reason that that he's been able to do a lot of the things he's been able to do. Right? Without a rebellious streak, I would have never gotten my butt out of the church pew. I would have been a youth pastor. And that wouldn't have been bad, but it wouldn't have been what he created me for. So my favorite thing about Jesus is that he is counter to everything. And that resonates with me because I am rebellious by nature. He's this paradox.
He's a sign of contradiction.
Exactly. And that fascinates me, and the mystery in that. At the same time, he's the most kind and loving and trustworthy person I've ever known. Right now our family's in a season where we are experiencing and diving into the adventure of Jesus and what it means to follow him.
Yes.
And how it should be an adventure. And that language was never really used for me. It was, we don't have to go into that, but we all know it used to be about following rules. And now a lot of us in the last 10 years have experienced grace in new ways, and it's not about keeping rules and this and that. But this new language in our family is around how he invites us to join him in this incredible adventure. And that brings a lot of life to me as a father of four boys.
Yes.
And so the last question is the piece of advice I would give listeners following Jesus would be to piggyback on that. And it's something that we've been championing with our kids. And I tell my boys all day, every day, hey, following Jesus is and should be an adventure. And if you ever find yourself in a place where it's not an adventure, that doesn't mean it's fun. It doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's enjoyable, but it should be an adventure. And if it's not, you might step back and wonder if you're actually following Jesus. You might be following something else or someone else. So there's that. I would chase after that adventure with him, because it should be that, and it should bring life. And for some people, that adventure might look like you go into practicing law. For others, it might be you're a traveling missionary in remote parts of the world. It might be you're a business owner. I mean, that's the beauty, is it looks different for everyone. But as long as you're seeking after him and insisting on it being an adventure, and never dull and never boring and always exciting. More just basic common things, I would say, given what we've shared in this time and what our life looks like, some things that are important to us is we have to stay in community. And that sounds so cliche, but I've seen so many people leave the church because they don't fit, but they don't replace it with any community. And I don't agree with that. I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah.
That's my biggest concern that I feel like will happen as what I described, I think the Holy Spirit is doing. My concern is that people will just let that be their excuse to not do anything. And they might say, oh, I still love Jesus. My wife and I pray, or we pray with the kids, but we've got to be in deep, authentic community with spiritual family. And I love using that phrase, because it really should be spiritual family. And so stay in that community, whatever it looks like. Don't let it get put in a box. It can look like a lot of different things, and it looks like different things in different seasons. When I was 23, we stayed up till 3 a.m. worshiping and praying in our living room. We obviously are up at 3 a.m. with our babies now, so we can't do that.
Right.
But I would just say press into that. And then next is keep your junk in the light. Like, don't let the enemy trick you and distract you and trick you into keeping sin issues in the dark. Bring them into the light in the context of a safe spiritual family that can walk with you through healing. And that's all part of that adventure. And that is, and I've learned to embrace that. A lot of people are afraid of that, and because it is hard, it's uncomfortable, and you have to be vulnerable, and you leave yourself exposed to people, and you leave yourself open to hurts and wounds, but you're also opening yourself up to the Father to embrace you and heal you and make you a better version of yourself than you ever were in that. So those would be the last few things I would throw out there.
All right. Aaron, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure, man.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.